Today, we start with a presentation by Wim Gijselaers. Wim is a full professor in educational research in the School of Business and Economics at Maastricht University in the Netherlands. His research focuses on creating learning environments, including social determinants of team cognition and team performance and judgment and decision making. His educational development work focused on further development of problem-based learning. Next to teaching in the award-winning master program Management of Learning, he teaches as a visiting professor at the University of Bern in Switzerland and in the postgraduate program of healthcare professionals. He is one of the stars in educating professionals in auditing and teaches a master course that receives the highest valuation of participants you can wish for. Today, Wim discusses how we can create environments where we enhance the likelihood that we learn from errors. The title of his presentation is Moving all the teams forward, designing firm environments for sustainable learning from errors. The floor is yours, Wim.
Thank you very much, Jan. Well, let's share our screen. So thank you very much for having me with you. And this is a presentation which was put together with my colleagues Therese Gronert and Roger Meeuwissen. And I would like to express my gratitude to them. And before I start talking about my research, our research, I want to start with a story, then present the research, and then reflect upon how the project progressed. And I thought that we are living in a time where a virus made us very well aware of all the constraints and boundaries and the space we're living in. And it felt like a fish swimming in a bowl. And you don't know that you're swimming in water until there is no water anymore. And when looking at the research we were doing, I can remember the days we had a similar flash where we got an idea of, well, maybe this is the way we can do research and auditing, and maybe we should give it and do it in a different way. And as a story, I want to share you the following. Many of you know that I'm a very passionate 737 pilot on a simulator. So normally my world is a little bit like this. And in my role as a captain, I work together with the flight crew. And the flight crew, when you look at them, they are responsible for cabin crew. And cabin crew has, together with the flight crew, they do not work in isolation. They work for a firm, and the firm works in an environment. So the question which popped up in my mind is, what if we are transporting passengers? And what if we take their fees into account? And what if inspection bodies would require aviation industry that we need to do more to understand and address shortfalls in performance? So what could they do if they would get that kind of question? The classic answer to it is, normally what you would do is you would start to try to improve your technology. That's what I did in aviation industry, and technology helped them substantially until they found somewhere in the 80s that more technology was not necessarily correlated with better improvements. So what they did then in those days was they started to improve safety procedures. Inspection became much more important, and the incentives to work safe were crucial to them. But after a while, the marginal returns of those kinds of measures, what we know is they go to nearly zero. And then what's being left is human capital, the importance of the people who are working there and the way they learn every day. And that idea brought us to the idea of maybe we could start looking at audit as in a different way, and we could do different research. Because what if, for auditing, there are reports by inspection bodies like AFM, IFER, and MCA, which are consistently emphasizing that audit firms need to do more to understand and address shortfalls in audit quality. The obvious answer would be they could invest in technology, they could invest in safety, inspection, and incentives. But that's not what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about the third factor in all of this. That's the importance of human capital. And human capital, that's you. That's the people who are working in the firm. And what we wanted to know is whether human capital is related to audit quality by taking a very typical perspective. We wanted to know the way people learn every day in their work, whether that helps them to reflect and to adapt to a changing world where they address the shortfalls in audit quality. So that's my story. And the question so we had is, what could audit firms do as a response to the challenges and errors being faced when looking at the firm level, the team level, and the individual level? And what we did was we conducted a literature review, we did interviews and surveys, and the focus for each level was, can we identify the drivers which enable team learning behavior? Can we look, when we're looking at the teams, can we identify team learning behaviors which enable responses to challenges and errors? And when looking for the individual, what can the individuals do to contribute to the team functioning? Okay. Now, our meta-analysis, that's a very typical way of reviewing literature. And what we did was we dived into literature and we identified more than 3,000 studies, where in the end we selected 50 studies which were discussing the research results of more than 4,000 teams. And the question we had was, when looking at the professional work in different contexts, so in auditing being included, and looking at healthcare, law, higher education, and aviation, we needed to find contexts which are imperfectly predictable, as they are in auditing. And where we said they need to be subject to constant change, to product development, high-tech productions, for example, R&D, financial services, and IT development. And we wanted to know, taking a look at studies on professionals in work-based team settings, what are the drivers which are determining their behavior? Well, the findings are in this research was that when you look overall of all those settings, that we identify, and looking at team learning behavior, we identified 4 different drivers which are determining team learning behavior. And team learning behavior is about whether or not a team can adapt to the challenges being faced. Okay, give you an example of what is meant by those variables, and also how strong the relationships are being reported in the literature. The first was tone at the top. We found a relatively low yet positive effect from tone at the top on the way teams learn in their work. And when looking at tone at the top, things which showed up were messages that were given by the tone at the top, the behavior as demonstrated by the leaders, and their authenticity in their behavior. So we found out that if the leaders are saying A, they are demonstrating the opposite behaviors, that is interpreted as non-authentic, and that has a negative impact. So tone at the top had a positive effect. And the second element which was important was infrastructure. And it was about the procedures which are held being in the companies, and that's about the knowledge management systems and their HR practices. Then more importantly, we found that the firm culture had a positive effect in terms of the values they expressed, the attention they pay to learning processes, whether or not they endorse innovation, and how they deal with their error management culture within the company. So is it more a shame or a blame company, or a culture, or is it much more a culture where they say, okay, things happened, let's sit together and let's see whether we can analyze the roots and the causes, and the second is, and what are we going to do in the near future? And the most important thing was whether or not the job resources, so in terms of support, time and budget, were supporting the work conditions in their work. Now we found 2 types of studies. We found robust findings, which held for firm values and the firm culture and job resources, where all studies were pointing out in the same direction. And we found less robust findings. And less robust findings is some studies found different results depending on the circumstances or the context in which the research was being conducted. So those were the 4 drivers for at the firm level, which are influencing the way teams work. And I'm talking about professional teams. And what I'm saying is audit teams make part of that kind of sample. Okay. So in conclusion, when you look at the firm level, what can be done is we identified 4 drivers. And the first driver, which is important, was tone at the top, firm culture, job resources, and infrastructure. And that sounds pretty obvious. But it was also important for us to figure out that those are, the good thing is those are the things which are under direct control of firm management, and they supplement the hard side of regulations and procedures. So what it says, on top of all the things being organized, like what I said in the beginning, there's technology, you have the procedures, you have the incentive structures. Those are things which can be done by the firm. And the other thing is we found that it enables audit teams to adapt to challenges, changes, and errors. So in my view, that sounds good, but it also sounds pretty obvious. It's not rocket science. Okay, but having said this, for management, this might provide the necessary tools to make a change. So let's continue. Now, the second part of the study was being conducted at a team level. So we looked at how the leaders are influencing their teams. And when looking at leaders, how they work with their teams, we were wondering, what is it that leaders require in terms of their behavior to enable the work of their teams? And we used interview methods, and we asked the people who were participating in the interview, please think about critical incidents which happens in your teams and give me an example of an effective team and an ineffective audit team. And we started asking them questions about what the characteristics were of the team, what they considered to be drivers of good performance and insufficient performance. And we asked them, when do teams learn from their work? And what we got was a series of beautiful stories where, although they used different words for it, that people were describing the different situations they were in. And we should take in mind that this happens from different perspectives, because when we are looking at the sample, our sample was based on the partners, managers, senior managers, and the associates and juniors, and we collected as many data as were needed until we reached a level of saturation, meaning that whenever we would have added another interview, we wouldn't have acquired more information or different information. And then we analyzed the data. So what we did is we made transcripts, we scored all the protocols based on theory about teams. And what I'm going to show you today is I'm going to visualize, as it says, the co-occurrences. A co-occurrences is, so whenever you say something about A and it goes together with B, and that's a co-occurrences, and we have visualized this in the model to show you the differences between what makes a team, an audit team, an effective one or a high performing versus a low performing. And before we start, let me show you our sample. We had 6 juniors, we had 8 seniors, we had 9 managers, and we had 6 partners and directors. Okay, so let's go to the results. As I said, our context was, they imagine an effective team and imagine an ineffective team the way you experienced it in the past. And then we looked at performance. We asked them about goal attainment, the audit quality, judgment quality, and improvements. And we were looking at the way teams work. Now, there are listed 4 words on the left side of the model. It says sharing information, it says co-construction, constructive conflict, and reflexivity. And I want to explain this in a couple of seconds, what is meant by it. And it will show you how things are related to being an effective or an ineffective team. What we found was, in the analysis, when people were describing the way they shared information, and how that connected to effective team or ineffective team, we found there was no difference in the amount of occurrences mentioned during the talk. So sharing information when you would observe a team doesn't make a difference whether you could predict, well, this is being an effective team or it's an ineffective team. However, when we looked at co-construction, we already noticed differences. And co-construction is, I'm saying something, and then someone else would say something on top of what I'm saying. And so we get an ever-increasing body of knowledge because we are constructing upon each other's knowledge. And what the effective teams differ already is that this building up process makes already a difference for the effective team and ineffective teams. But then the most important part we found was when we started looking at constructive conflict. And constructive conflict is, I'm saying something, and then you would say, hey, wait a minute, but I have a different view on what's happening. And since I'm disagreeing, I want to discuss this with you. Some would say in research literature, it's a productive conflict. It's the right to agree to disagree. And it's kind of a lively debate. And what our data were constantly showing was that effective teams, the ones who we interviewed and thinking about that, they mentioned 3 times as much that kind of behavior when connecting it to an effective team as compared to an ineffective team. And then the final thing was reflexivity was the ultimate thing which made a difference when you want to see the difference between effective and ineffective teams. It was 4 times mentioned more than all the rest when identifying an effective team. And reflexivity is about you analyze what has happened and then you reflect on what are the consequences for the near future. So the ones who were discussing and describing behavior of an ineffective team, that was the same amount mentioned as sharing information. But if you compare it for effective teams, reflexivity was mentioned at least 4 times more. So that implies when you would look at teams and you want to know, is this an effective team, yes or no? In terms of their behavior, the differences lie in constructive conflict and reflexivity. Now, again, when you looked at the way effective teams were discussing their performance, they were equally balanced in terms of goal attainment, judgment, quality, while the ineffective teams mentioned that substantially fewer times. And when you looked at effective teams versus ineffective teams on improvements, that was nearly equal. But going more into detail, when we are discussing constructive conflict and reflexivity, we should take in mind that those are things where you are getting into a situation with your team members where you start challenging the other constantly, yet you do it under the condition that you feel safe to do so. You don't challenge others in an audit team if you don't feel safe to speak up in the team. And the other was that those teams, these effective teams, they had built in formal moments of reflexivity. So it was not just a thing like, well, we are very reflective as an individual. No, the team had moments built in their whole audit process where they said, well, let's analyze where are we right now, how can we improve, and what are the consequences for the near future. So that gives you a lot of hope in getting a better understanding what audit teams do, but also the way you might manage those teams. Then the third level, we looked at the individual level. So we had the firm, we had the team, and now we started collecting data about the individuals and how they may contribute to the audit teams. And our question was, which individual leadership behaviors and beliefs effectively enable learning behavior at the team level as a response to challenges and errors? So think about this. There is challenge, which says we need to avoid as much as we can to make any serious mistakes in our work, or we are confronted with an error, let's see what we can do. And we gave them surveys. And the survey was based on the classic, I would say, the leadership equation. And the classic leadership equation is you only get team learning if there is sufficient level of reflexivity, there is welfare, there is vulnerability, and the leader invites you to contribute, and there are clear goals which you need to achieve. And for reflexivity, you may say that's a facilitated process. You can schedule moments where people start to reflect on the work they are doing. And welfare, vulnerability, and inviting are getting close to what a leader can do to empower the others in the team and make them shine. And goals is typically something about directive leader behavior. This is what we need to do. Please take in mind we have so many hours left and there's a deadline to make our audit work. We looked at those 3 elements, and what we did is we gave many people within the companies, we gave them a survey. And in this survey, so we had 246 people ranging from partners, senior managers to the associates and juniors, and 2 big 4 firms and 1 mid-tier. And we asked them to rate the directive leader behavior when they were thinking about a team they had worked with in the past. And we asked them the way to rate them on how that team, the behavior they were showing, could be characterized in terms of the team learning behaviors. And of course, that was a survey with a pre-structured question. And what we found was two very typical responses. One graph is like, it doesn't matter, with an increase of directive leader behavior, you basically don't see any connection with team learning behavior. And your is, I love directive leadership behavior because the moment is being done, I see an enormous increase in team learning behavior. Now, normally, if I would have been with you at Nyenrode University, I would have asked the audience, please give the break 1 minute, discuss which graph belongs to what level you are in the company. Is the vertical graph much more a junior associate thing, or is it a partner thing, or is it the other way around? Now the answer, we don't have the time for this, and I can't see your faces and whatever. The answer was partners basically were not that responsive to directive leader behavior. So when we asked partners, think about your leader, they felt like I don't prefer that kind of behaviorship. And the interesting part was that associates are very, I wouldn't say very positive, but at least it's appreciated if this behavior is being demonstrated. And keep in mind that directive leadership is about, do we stick to our goals? Am I clear on what we want to achieve? For the senior managers, it was a little bit like the associates. But the interesting finding was that partners have a different view on how what the impact is of their leaders and how it impacts their teams as compared to associates. So it goes back to the old adage that young people are much more in favor of structure. They need structure, and the more experience you get, basically you don't want to, it doesn't inspire you. Let me put it this way. Okay, so then we ask them about empowering leadership. So same group again, we have the partners, the managers and whatever, the same people, 264. And now we ask them, well, when you think about the teams you have been working with in the past, now rate the way you perceived empowering leader behavior from the one who is exerting the leadership upon you. And then we measured again team learning behavior.
In 5 more minutes, Wim.
Yes. And we found two graphs again, or three, but let's compare. There's graph number 1 and there's graph number 2. And the question was, is that who is on which graph? Now the good news is, at least for me, is that the partners all of a sudden prefer the empowering leadership, and because they perceive it as it contributes to team learning behavior, and it goes along similar lines as the associates, and it goes along similar lines with senior managers. So the question is, what do we learn from this? What we learned from it is that depending on the level you are in the company, you have a different view on what contributes to team learning behavior, and it's related to the hierarchical position. And you can very well imagine that the ones who are at the higher levels within a company, that they need a different line of support than the ones who are just entering the company and have 2 or 4 years of work experience. And that's the thing you can people train and prepare for. So in a way, that's why I felt this sounds like good news, because it depends on the stage of your development. And as a final slide then, so let me share you some reflections on the research we did. And basically I want to share with you the reflections on our research project, the way it was set up and the way it was organized and the way FAR might develop further in the near future. The first reflection we want to share with you is that whatever you do as a research team, create strong partnerships with practice. Meaning you have to invest in a long-standing relationship with the offices, the firms, so that they start trusting you and you are trusting them, and that you have a shared goal to work for. So that the research adapts to practice and practice adapts to the research, so they start to understand each other's languages. The second lesson we learned was that engage in elaborating research questions together. So one of the crucial things for us was that while we were trained as classic academics who are used that you go to a company with your research questions and you ask them whether they are interested in you, we said maybe it's a better way if you start working, developing the questions together as a group, because so that increases your commitment. And the third lesson was that follow up after the project has been done and build long-term relationships through clinical research, as I said. Because the parallel is in healthcare, there are the bioscientists working together with the clinicians, and you might say the auditors in the firms, they are the clinicians in this case. And what we strongly endorse is that you work together with auditors in practice and the firm as if they are the clinicians for audit practice. And then join with them, build long-term relationships like we did. And then we are convinced that on the long run, the benefits are so much more than if you would just operate at the baseline level. So those are the reflections I want to share with you. I apologize for the inconvenience caused by me by not sharing the screen in the beginning. And I wish I could have seen you and we would have a discussion afterwards during a long break. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Wim. Actually, I was talking here at Nijrode, and we didn't miss your first slides because I mean, it is so clear what you say that, you know, we can even do it without slides in that respect. So it was an excellent presentation. Thank you very much for that, and we enjoyed it a lot. Now, Fabian Klar will be the discussant of your paper, and he also will lead the discussion from the participants, the audience that we have. So from now on, Fabian, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Wim, for the presentation. There is one question here in the group chat. Reflectivity is a big issue for auditing standard setters, and they are writing it into a lot of their revised standards. Is it something that can be constructed by standards, or does it need to come from within the heart of the audit teams?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question because it goes back to when I started sharing the story about aviation. When they needed to improve the safety in aviation, so they improved the technology. Then they started working on working with increased level of safety procedures. And then they found out that people don't necessarily adhere to safety procedures. That's the first lesson, because it's not owned by them. So it's about the ownership. The other is if many of those procedures and audit principles are not developed by the firm themselves. They are a stakeholder in this whole process of getting there. But many times for professionals, it's crucial that they are the owner of the solution. Now, so in my mind, the obvious answer is this is typically something which the firm should endorse on top of what I said, the technology and the importance of safety procedures. And if the firm endorses it and by demonstrating their leadership, my expectations but also my experience is that after 2 or 3 years, slowly the behavior of audit teams will change. So introducing moments of reflexivity, that's something which should be done by the firm. And as a side note or as a fun fact, we had done some research 2 years ago where we put audit teams in a kind of an audit team simulation, and we gave them a very complicated case. And some teams got a 2 minutes pre-check before they started analyzing the case. And we call that the before action reflection intervention. And others didn't. And guess what? The ones who just used their 2 minutes time in advance, and the ones who also did the same somewhere halfway in their review process, they had a substantially better performance as we measured on the case. And that's something which is firm driven.
Thank you. I think a very elaborate answer. There's another question. Did any learning behaviors emerge from the qualitative data, or did you map the data on the a priori constructs derived from the extant literature?
What we did was, so there's got quite a substantial body of literature on team learning behavior. And where it says, whenever you look at teams and you want to know whether they learned, so changing their behaviors, we used a review, which, well, now I'm getting not sure. Are you talking about review comments, or are you talking about the literature review?
I think it is the qualitative data which came from the interviews.
Yeah. So with the qualitative data, what you get, the interviews, you make a transcript out of it, and then you start imposing the theoretical constructs on what people are saying. So what you do is, and we are coding it. This is typically a fragment where they are talking about psychological safety, for instance, although they are not using the word psychological safety, but they might say something like, I felt happy to speak up, or it was just great for me to have a discussion with the partner where I felt I was free to have a debate with my partner. And so in this emerging process, we imposed those concepts based on literature reviews.
Okay, I hope that helped. And then on the slide on learning at the team level, it shows that sharing info has only a weak link to effective team and ineffective teams.
Yeah.
May that imply that learning in teams may occur only at the individual level?
No. What it says is good. Thank you. This is a good question for clarification. The strength of that slide is that it shows that when you look at teams and the way they exchange information, if they stay at the level of sharing information only, then you get a kind of a shallow discussion. Yeah, that would mean, suppose you and me are a team right now, and you would say, I can see that sales are like this and return is like that. And I would could you give me the numbers on this? That's where we start exchanging information. And if it stays at that level without saying that's a high or that's a low, and where basically I'm giving you the information you would need, and then it stays at that, that's typically behavior for sharing information. And if that, when you take a look at that behavior, it doesn't make the distinction between the effective team versus the ineffective team. Yeah, you get just a shallow conversation. And the difference is whether you might bring in on top of that, or you start disagreeing with me. Well, looking at your numbers and the way you are drawing conclusions about it, I have a different view.
Yeah, and then you need the constructive conflict and the emotional safety in order to get that going.
Yeah. Maybe a comparison is think about we are a team, you and me, and basically I'm not interested in you. Yeah, suppose that will be the case. Then we will limit whatever things we want to share to the lowest level, and that's the facts, that's the details, and the information as it is, without adding any value or judgment or evaluation upon it.
Yeah.
At the moment I feel like I can work together with you, I would ask you, and what do you think about it?
Okay, thank you. Do you expect differences in reflexivity ability between auditors? What type of auditors in terms of personal characteristics are better able to reflect?
Well, it's the reflexivity which is being developed within a team. So it's the group of individuals which are put together, and from what we know is that reflexivity is not a personal trait. So it's not a matter of putting people there we're saying they are more reflexive than others. It happens because of the leader, and it happens because the leader, together with the team, feels it's important to build in kind of a midterm review or as a startup. And what's essential in all of this is that's what we found on the research, the managers play a crucial role. Because think about this, one of the things we found on our research was when we asked partners about, can you describe your teams? They were much more mentioning the managers, the senior managers and directors. Well, if you ask the managers, describe the way your team works, they were referring to their juniors, their associates, in combination with the ones who were higher in their hierarchy. So that's one. And the other was that we noticed that for managers to manage this whole process, which puts them many times under a lot of stress, it's important to build in moments where they can discuss in a, let's say, in a conflict-free zone, the way they are making progress. That was one of the reasons why we helped them out by giving them instruments which can be used for reflection. So reflection is not a kind of a soft thing. It's much more like, hey, this is the checklist on the way we want to make progress. And then you evaluate, are we making the progress, yes or no?
So it is more of a team thing and on the team composition level. So would it be that there are some personal traits of individuals which go better together?
Well, the answer is no. So there have been loads of studies which have been examining whether, when looking at team composition, whether they could predict performance. Yeah, and because the analogy is more like in soccer teams. Yeah, if the ones who have Messi with them and Frankie de Jong, they are the ones who are probably win the game. Well, all the research says there is a zero correlation between team composition and team performance. The difference is being made whether the team, given their compositions, have the capacity to create a real team. And that implies that you can do two things. You can train those people for their different roles. And that's where I feel there is the L&D department which comes in. And you can train them to collaborate. That's also what I do in soccer teams. Yeah, so you don't want to have individual stars only in your team. So that's a matter of training. And the third thing is about the leadership, which feels like, am I much more looking at achieving my goal only, or is every time when I meet a new team for an engagement, an audit engagement, is this for me also a tool where I can develop my people within the company? So it's not only the work being done, but it's also a developmental tool.
Okay. Yeah. Are these findings research across all firm sizes, so big four and small firms, because smaller firms have different team structures?
The answer is yes. What you don't see is that I have a colleague in my room and she is saying, say yes.
Could you elaborate on whether the correlations you found may be due to the third factor or reflect reverse causality? I don't know what this exactly means or at which point of the presentation it perhaps someone could.
We have five minutes left. So the question is are we actually looking at reverse causality here, right? What is causing what?
Yeah, that's a good question. Think about this. In this case, there wasn't an experimental situation. We gave them a questionnaire, and then you ask people to think back and to reflect, and then what you get is, of course, the classic causality problem. But we 1 year after we had done our first studies in this, we had the privilege to work together with a big four firm where we could run experiments. And in those experiments, we were building in intervention to figure out, is there any causality, yes or no, when it gets to the reflexivity. And so we had the luck that we could build in reflection tools at certain moments in the process. And there we found the causality. Yes, it matters. But we could only figure this out under experimental conditions, under very strict controlled conditions when working with a firm for several years. While in the study I was presenting right now, you know, that I would say that's undecided when it gets to the very clear restrictions of how can you measure causality. But in other research, we did find it.
Okay. And then I think a follow-up question to that, to what extent did you consider factors like time pressure to affect both learning behavior and team effectivity?
Yeah, that's a classic. So what time pressure normally does, it lowers your capacity to learn after, you know, if I keep increasing the time pressure, at some moment it starts dropping, but it's an inverted U in my view, because you need some pressure. That's a good thing, but after a certain level, it cuts off. And but pressure does is it avoids the process to learn from each case. And as a side effect, what you get is that people may become overconfident in what they are doing. And being overconfident in the work is a serious risk. Because then, because of the time pressure, you need to make shortcuts. And the shortcutting behavior contains a certain risk. So dealing with time pressure and budget pressure is a serious issue within the firm, and that's what we found in our research over and over again. And what we also found was that being confident, when you know the level of confidence, that's a very poor predictor when you ask people when you measure their performance. And actually, it is that the correlation is 0 for male. For females, there is a linear relationship. If you would ask them how confident they are about their judgment, it's a nearly perfect predictor. So that's another issue for the firm. I would say the way you manage your culture and the way you manage gender issues. And so time pressure, yes, if you need to deal with it, because you can say, well, let's face it, it's there, then the reflexivity tool helps you substantially. Because that's also what we did in another study, is we put teams under a high time pressure, and the ones who were working under high time pressure together with the reflexivity tools did substantially better than the ones who didn't have the reflexivity tool.
Thank you. I
Yeah,
think
so maybe you might be efficient, but not very effective in the long run.
Thank you very much. I think we're about at time.
Yes, I'm afraid this is all the questions we have time for now, but for those questions that haven't been touched on by Wim, there will be a podcast later on that will actually deal with his questions